Okay, since I just started the recording, I'm gonna introduce our first presenter for tonight. Thanks again for everyone for attending. We have Mel Lacroix from the CSIO, Canadian Sport Institute of Ontario, and she is a physiologist. She's the lead for the CSIO in physiology, and she will be doing a presentation on recovery. So I'm just going to pass it on to you, Mel. And actually, before I do that, I just want to make sure everyone is aware of the possibility for the chat. If you have any questions, Google Meet is a little bit limited in functions as far as putting up your hand or anything like that. So it's best to use the chat. And if you can stay muted, that would be great. And just put your questions in the chat. And I'll just be monitoring the chat because it's not possible for the presenters to actually see the chat while they present. So thank you. And Melissa, over to you. You're still on mute, Mel. There you go.
Go one thing at a time here. Can you guys see the screen or not yet?
Not yet. We can see you.
Okay. And sorry, it's not letting me.
It's coming.
Anything yet? Sorry.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Were you able to see anything there?
No, it was basically showing that you are trying to present and sort of the pictures of everyone on the slides. I think it was trying to load it. Try that again.
Let's try this one.
Yes.
How about that? Good there?
Yeah, we got it.
All right. I can't see you guys though, so just maybe, yeah, if you have any questions or anything, maybe if you can just go off mute and give me a shout, I'm good with that.
And I'll monitor the chat for you too.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Yeah, awesome, thanks for having me tonight. As Katja said here, I work at CSI Ontario as a lead physiologist, but I've also been working last year, almost 2 years now, I guess, with the cross-country ski group out in Thunder Bay with Timo and his crew. So that's been fun, and that's how kind of I got connected, I think, through here. And I see Patty is on the call as well, and I've done a bit of work through with her and her group with the Para Nordique. So I have a little bit of experience working with some of the different groups in Ontario for cross-country ski. So it's great to be on here today to help you guys out. So today, just going to go through and talk a little bit about recovery, what, when, and kind of how it all comes together. And so let's see if we're working. So we're going to just kind of start off a little bit on what recovery is and just review some of that overload rest principle and why recovery is so important and where does it fit into the YTP. And within that, and a big part of recovery and leading into competitions is that taper. And so we're going to touch on that just a little bit. And then the good old recovery modalities. There's a ton of things out there right now, and that athletes are looking to use. And so just going to go through some of the ones that are highly in terms of research backed versus those that might not as much, but are still in high use by athletes. So cover that a little bit, and then just kind of wrap it all in and pull it all together at the end. I'm gonna get right into it here. in terms of recovery and adaptation. So recovery is something that is happening all the time. So in terms of, we're jumping ahead, but in terms of recovery and what it means is when athletes are training, I'll show you in a minute here, but essentially athletes spend more time in doing recovery versus actually training. So the amount of time that they're actually training is very little when you look at whether it's in a week, in a year, over their career. A lot of their time is spent more on the recovery side versus the actual training side. And so I'll put that into numbers for you here in a minute. But in terms of what that actually means is, and what we're doing during that process of recovery is it's essentially returning our body back to its normal condition. So with exercise, we're putting the athletes into different stress, right? So we're putting stress onto them. Their bodies are going through stress with training, and now we're through that recovery process. What you're trying to do is really just trying to return back to normal as quickly as possible, so you can put additional stress and adaptations onto them. So specifically what's happening from a physiological standpoint is the muscle is trying to, essentially those energy producing enzymes and contractile proteins, they're trying to restore and resynthesize. Same thing with our energy stores, so those carbs, those fats, they're trying to recover and resynthesize as well and restore. And then our endocrine system and immune system, those as well are being suppressed with putting that stress and training on us. So again, that's trying to recover during that period. So some of the different ways and what we're trying to do in optimize recovery is going to involve, sorry, I've got an automatic forward on here. So optimizing recovery involves rest, some nutrition interactions, and then on the coaching side really is that training load management and having some acute strategies for the athletes as well. This is what I was speaking about earlier, is just that % of time spent competing versus recovering. So this is actually showing from an elite swimmer, some of the time actually spent, so broken down from training. You can see that piece of the pie is very small, right? So only 13% spent training, and this is over kind of if you even look over to the bottom right corner, time spent during an actual quadrennial, that time is very, very minute compared to that time spent recovering, which is, you can see there at the bottom left, over 86, 88% of that time is being in that recovery. So really we need to be thinking about, yes, there's a lot of thought that needs to go into the training program itself. And a lot of that needs to be thought about both on the athlete side, but from the coaching perspective as well, as what are the athletes doing during that time of recovery, and how are the programs reflecting what those regeneration weeks might look like. So from an overload rest principle, I'm sure you guys have all seen this before, so probably just a review for most of you, but just to kind of go through this. So essentially we have our performance level, so the line in the middle here. What we're doing with training obviously is putting some stress onto the body. So again, that stimulus is that training. Fatigue is going to happen, and you do want that to happen to obviously get that overload with training. So here at the bottom, you can see a lot of the things that are happening. Yes, there's going to be that fuel depletion, muscle damage, dehydration, mental fatigue, all those things are occurring with training and when you put stress on the athlete. But that recovery really depends on what is happening in these pieces of recovery underneath here to get that super compensation, which is essentially increasing from training how much of that performance you're going to get after that training. And it really depends on that recovery underneath there that you're going to get that full compensation, super compensation. So you can see here an under recovered, what that looks like. So again, if you have that same training stimulus, yet that recovery is not there. So poor nutrition, not enough rest, maybe not enough regen, in terms of too much training, too much overload on them, not enough time in between to recover well enough. You'll see that super compensation isn't going to happen, or it might happen, but a lot later, so not as soon. So you can see that red line being pushed over to the right and a little bit lower. Optimal recovery would look something like this, is if athletes and the program really have, you're looking at refueling, good hydration, looking at, I have hydrotherapy in here, but this is just any type of looking at modalities that work for that athlete, make sure that sleep and the training load management is there. Then yes, you can and will see a little bit more in terms of that, that be able to happen in terms of the training and performance level much sooner than if you weren't. And then finally, the last piece to that is if, in order to get the training stimulus and the adaptations you want, obviously there needs to be enough of that training stimulus there. And if there's not enough of that training stimulus, then and enough good fatigue or enough good stress being put on the athlete, then you may not get as high following that in terms of performance level. So really needing to focus on how to manage that training load and how to manage that recovery to really be able to get that, that compensation afterwards for performance. What that looks like in terms of periodizing our training. And so in terms of weeks, having a good progressive loading and regenerations in there. So inserting some of those breaks, inserting those regeneration weeks, and what that looks like going into tapers as well. So I'm going to give you a few examples here in terms of how to plan that, those chronic and acute recovery phases into the plans. And so how often do we really need these recovery phases or weeks? And everyone is a little bit different here. And this is where I have a bit of a continuum in terms of, you can see on this slide here from the left to the right, and this is these numbers at the top are looking at weeks. So looking at doing progressive weeks. So if you have a 2-to-1 in terms of your ratio for weeks of progressive overload to a recovery week, a recovery phase. So what that might look like depending is, so first if you're late in a quadrennial, so if we're looking at obviously Olympic sport, Paralympic sport, quadrennial, so you might be looking at a 4-year period. So maybe late in the quadrennial, you'd be looking at a shorter period here versus early on in the quad, you could do a little bit longer. So 4 to 6 weeks to a one rest ratio. Looking at your specific prep, competition prep versus general prep would be, again, one of those you would err on the side of lower, and so more recovery during your specific and competition preps versus general prep. You can and are looking to push that overload a little bit more for 4 to 6. And then for I'm sure most of you on the call, I'm assuming quite a few of you work with younger athletes. And so that's something also to think about, is athletes who are just starting and or younger athletes, is looking at including a bit more of those recovery and more on that 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio versus having longer and for the progression of those recovery phases. And then when, again, you're looking at peak prime athletes or older athletes who have a lot of experience behind them and have a lot of that training behind them, that's where, again, you can progress into some of those bigger, longer training phases. So really just those repeated training and then having that recovery bout in there. So again, decreasing our training load and our volume is what, again, looking back at those the slides earlier, is what's going to create those adaptations to increase performance. This is just another example of a bit of a training kind of looking at volume and intensity. So this is more on a strength kind of program here, looking at what those phases would look like from if you're in a hypertrophy. So if you're working on just overall capacity, then those you might do here, looking at a 3-week to a one week deload. You can see kind of where that deload is happening. It's going to be back to, in terms of volume, pre almost that first week here. So you can see that deload. And then if you're looking at doing any type of strength type more work, you can see intensity might go up, but volume up here is going to go down. So that intensity deload versus volume deload, and how you can spread it out here based on what you're doing. So whether it's a work capacity phase or a strength phase, those might change a little bit. So I'm just going to get in a little bit in terms of the taper and what it means in terms of recovery. And so, because it much like recovery in general, what's happening in the taper phase is we're essentially just reducing our overall training load. So the volume of what you're doing leading up to a competition, because the aim of it is to maximize performance. So to really get across what recovery means is look at it in a way that you would plan on almost like a taper. Is what's happening during that phase is you're really recovering from a lot of the physiological capacities that you've put on those athletes. So all the stress that you've put on the athletes during the training and the overload into those weeks leading into the taper. During that taper period, you're really just restoring a lot of those physiological capacities that are happening. So your tolerance to training and resulting in, you're going to result in that adaptations during the taper. And so here you can see Mujica. He's a researcher. He does quite a bit of work in the tapering and peaking. So if you haven't seen any of his work in this area, something to definitely look into there. And you can see here from this one, again, from one of his papers, there's quite a few things happening in terms of physiological changes that are associated with pre-event tapers for athletes. And a lot of this stuff is happening during recovery periods throughout the year, but especially during a taper after like what would be an overload phase and then going into more of that taper recovery phase. These are some of the things that you might expect and might see is some of that increase in VO2 max. There's changes happening at the red blood cell level, so the volume of plasma volume, the hematocrit. So a lot of different things going on there. It could have some increases in testosterone levels, increases in glycogen concentrations, the increases in oxidative enzyme capacities. So all of these relating back to that VO2 and ability to perform at a high level. And then over here on the psychological changes, there could be during this time, there's usually an effect in a reduced perception of effort. So how hard the athlete's actually working. It could be reduced in mood disturbances, reduction in perceptions of their fatigue. So that would be increasing and it would be a positive effect there. And then quality of sleep, increased vigor. So all things that could and do normally happen during this phase of a taper that you would expect. For a taper phase, what you'd be looking at is 2-week duration. So normally a lot of the research is showing kind of in between a 7 to 28 day taper in terms of length. And again, this really comes down to how experienced your athletes are and how much you did beforehand. So what that training phase is leading into the taper look like. So a heavier training load coming into that taper may need a longer taper. So more on that the higher end of those days versus if those training loads prior to weren't as much, then a shorter 7-day would suffice. So this is something that you would absolutely want to trial on your own and look to individualize with the group that you're with. And each athlete will be very different here. Training loads itself, so this would be kind of on the volume end. You'd be looking at decreasing to about 41 to 60% of what you were doing previously. And then in terms of frequency of training, trying to keep that within 80%. So trying to keep the amount and the frequency of what the training looks like in a weekly, at least into that 80% range. But then the same research or article here showing just that in terms of a taper, it does depend and is a little bit different per sport and per activity that you're doing, but across and in general, those rules do apply in terms of decreasing about 40 to 60%, and then in around that 7 to 20 days across the different modalities. But in terms, as I said, it really depends on the severity of fatigue coming into that taper and that training phase, and really individualizing it for each athlete. And in terms of being able to individualize this for everybody, it's important to be able to monitor and track what you're doing, because coming into those training phases, like you said, you want to be decreasing maybe your training volume from 40 to 60% of what you were doing in the phases previously or earlier in the year. But if you don't know what you were doing, then you can't plan ahead to be able to properly plan the taper. So being able to understand what you've done in the past with your athletes to be able to plan ahead for that taper is really key and important here. I just want to show you quickly, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail here, but there's some pretty good papers where there's a case study on one of the best cross-country skiers, females out of Norway. And this paper really just follows along her career over a span from 2000 to 2017. And it gives a really good detail of some of the training that they did, and some of the different phases and how long and what those training loads were going into the final competitions and phases. So just a few things kind of noting on that, the taper itself, but where so here, looking at the training volumes, they essentially in the first, they had a couple different phases going into this would be the Olympics here, but a couple different phases going into that final taper, which would have been the last 2 weeks going into a comp. And you can see the reduction. So here the green being more of the light intensity that the training load they were doing, and then yellow being medium and red being high. So this is just kind of the volume of work in those different types, just the distribution across. And you can see going into the final 2 weeks, so day 14 to 8 and day 7 to 1, that training volume did go down. So they knew essentially what they were doing in those general prep phases 1, 2, 3, and then going down into that decreases of up to 30% of reduction into the very final week. But I would suggest, I'm not going to go too detailed into this, but if you are interested a little bit more, I would suggest there's a few articles I can send out with this presentation later on some of these details here on how that was polarized. But the main part of this that I want to kind of to show and get out of this was just how if you can again plan and individualize your taper, you really need to be able to monitor what you've been doing and what your daily training plan looks like ahead of time to plan in those recovery phases and tapers. So how do we actually monitor recovery throughout a training year? And with all of our athletes, there's a ton of different things out there that in terms of wearables right now as well. So how can we monitor our athletes and their readiness to perform? And so I know with some of the groups I've used different questionnaires. So just asking them how they feel, looking at RPs and training hours is one way, but in terms of actually understanding the athletes and understanding their subjective, there's a couple different questions I can throw up here in a second, just in terms of, actually here, I'll throw it up now, it's not there. So there are some questions that you can throw up and look at. So one, I would say looking at asking them what their fatigue levels are, what their stress levels are, and then going into sleep hours and sleep quality will be another one, which I'll get into sleep in a little bit, and how you can monitor some of those different things. But just understanding and getting an idea from your athletes every day when they show up to training of how they're actually feeling is one way to understand what they're going through subjectively. Watches, I know a lot of athletes probably have their own watches in terms of polar to monitor heart rate and different things there, but it really comes down to how much time you have to look at all that data and who you have on your support team to look at that. But there's different options there just for the athletes themselves to be able to see and understand how they're feeling and what they're feeling and how that approaches to what their recovery looks like. So one way I know quite a few of the athletes have gotten into, even within the group at Thunder Bay, we're looking at doing their own HRV training. So there's a couple different apps that do this quite well and have some pretty good feedback for it. And so I know Apple Watch has a good ability to do this if athletes are wearing it while sleeping. There's the HRV for Training app where they can use it with their finger as they wake up. And one thing I know, a lot of feedback from athletes is it's tough to know what those changes mean and what they are. And so again, I'll send this out after, but this I find very helpful just to have available to look at in terms of what some of those changes do mean. So what happens if their resting heart rate goes down, or what happens if the RMSD is up? And so looking at this type of graph here gives a bit of understanding as to, for the athletes who are doing this on their own, and for you coaches as well, monitoring what the interpretation means for these things. But do need to be careful that a lot of these wearables right now need to know which ones are a little bit more accurate versus the others, because there's a lot that can affect when you're monitoring HRV or heart rate in general. So things to definitely be mindful of with those right now. In terms of monitoring with doing any type of testing, so another way you can monitor some of the readiness following phases. So whether it's what you can do is set up something very, very easy to monitor pre-training phases and post-training phases and recovery phases. So after maybe a really hard training block, you have a bit of a recovery phase, and then you would introduce one of these tests, some sort of test specific to you guys. So it could be a time trial, could be something as simple as doing a counter movement jump, or a jump, like a long jump that you're measuring, just to see some of those different measures from strength to also aerobic or anaerobic. So having like a time trial that you can do pre and post, just to see essentially how they're responding and monitoring their heart rate, time, or distance during that test, to see how they're adapting to the training. I'm going to quickly just get into some of the different recovery modalities. And so I know there's quite a few things out there, but in terms of looking at the high evidence scale, and in terms of even money, where to put your most attention on. So obviously stress management and training management load would be that number one. So we'll touch on that a little bit, and life balance would be in there as well. That next foundation here in terms of recovery would be the two top in terms of high evidence scale would be your sleep and nutrition, and then everything else would be kind of on top as that next that next 2% that you can get out of it. But everything else really comes down to that base of making sure that the training loads and the stress management, and then the sleep and nutrition. And so I saw this the other day and thought it was pretty funny and accurate in terms of where athletes' minds are usually at, is that they want the quick fix in terms of the foam rolling, the supplements, whatever new garments are out there. And then you have the the two modalities, or the two recovery strategies, over here as the jealous girlfriend, the sleep and nutrition, saying, well, what about us? And that's usually the case, and that's why the education around some of these things are super important for you as the coaches to be able to help them with. So on that note, how can you help your athletes recover better? And that's knowing you have the training plan in place and you have the recovery weeks set out for them, but what are they doing during that time? So the number one thing that I would say in terms of educating the athletes themselves is the most effective and feasible, underrated recovery strategy is sleep, which I know with younger athletes it is tough to get them on board with this at times, but it is, in terms of performance enhancing, it is the number one recovery tool. And so some of the things that are happening during our sleep is, a lot of the physiological growth and the repairs are happening during that time. Any type of motor pattern learning. So the saying of practice makes perfect, or really practice and sleep is what makes perfect, because you could practice all you want, but without that sleep and recovery behind you, you may not get exactly everything out of that practice that you would have wanted. And that comes with that motor pattern learning. So if you're learning a new skill or learning a new technique of some sort at training one day, that night's sleep is very important in terms of being able to learn that and maintain that memory over time. And so here, that memory enhancement, and I can go down here with all of these, but I'm sure you get the point, and you all understand that in terms of decision making, stress management, all of these things are impacted with sleep and can be enhanced with sleep, with proper sleep. So the key, the 4 main keys to optimal sleep. So we have quantity. So there's quite a few research out there showing athletes, especially at the younger age, really need at least a minimum of 8 hours. Elite athletes, we're looking at least 9 to 10 hours, and needing that quality of sleep being up into that 80 to 90%. Quality sleep really is how effective your sleep was. So how rested you felt when you woke up in the morning. And so were you waking up multiple times throughout the night? Were you able to fall asleep quickly? Those types of things. And in the morning, are you using an alarm, and are you waking up right away, or how refreshed do you feel, and are you constantly pressing the snooze button when you wake up? So those would be the two main keys there. And then timing. Everybody does have a different what you call kind of your circadian rhythm, but everyone has a different. Some people are early birds, some people are night owls. So really based on how people or athletes are, it can be very individual, but making sure that they at least wake up and go to bed around the same time. So it really becomes an issue when someone is going to bed really late one night, but then really early the next night. They're sleeping in till the afternoon one day, but then have to wake up super early for training another day. And so really trying to keep a consistent schedule is key to having that well-rested sleep. There's quite a few, like I mentioned, studies in and around this area of sleep and how it can affect performance. And again, that baseline of having at least that 8 hours and even above 9 hours of sleep can really improve performance. And this study here was showing, based off of basketball and doing a skilled-based sport, and just in terms of the reaction times, but overall, even in mood and stress management, all of those things can be improved with sleep. And one thing I wanted to really highlight with this study here was to show that one bad sleep won't hinder performance. So a lot of athletes prior to competition might have 1 night or 2 nights of sleep where they're a little bit stressed, so they don't get enough rest. And this study and many studies have shown that is okay. It won't necessarily impact performance if it's just a one-off here and there. But where it becomes that big impact is if it's a chronic lack of sleep over a week or multiple weeks at a time. So something in terms of you just giving the athletes that confidence it is okay if they're having a bad sleep before a competition. It won't necessarily hinder their sleep or their performance just that one time, but if it's happening quite a bit, then that's where it would become an issue. A few things here, and I know this is more athlete associated, but I'm going to keep these on here for you guys later to help your athletes with as well, is some of the 4 main keys to optimal sleep. So avoiding some of these things, so alcohol, blue light, caffeine before sleep, consistency, we've touched on that already, just on waking up and going to bed around the same time and having a good environment to sleep in. So wearing night shades to make it nice and dark in the room and nice and cool in the room as well. So this one here it is pretty timely in terms of sleep and how it can affect performance. And we all know that having you can't coach athletes who aren't healthy, and so sleep plays a big role on athletes being healthy in their immune system. And timely right now with COVID and cold and everything and the flus going around is having that the importance of getting a good night's sleep can affect their ability in their immune system. So again, that less this article and research is just showing how less than 7 hours of sleep, your odds and ratios of getting any type of cold or flu is much higher, and same thing with the quality of sleep. Similarly to illnesses, injuries is on par with that as well in terms of having a higher risk of injuries based on decreased amount of sleep hours. So here you can see that 6 hours, anything below 7 hours, that risk is a lot higher for injury compared to that 8 and 9 hours of sleep. Obviously, the reality of getting a lot of sleep for these athletes who are in school, who are trying to balance kind of work life and training. So just continuing to really educate them on some of these things. And one thing to keep in mind is napping is a great way to help with this as well. And short naps, so keeping them to 30 minutes. But one key to that is really just scheduling it into their schedule. So much like you do with their training and everything else is make sure they schedule, if they know that there's going to be a day or a couple days that they're be a little bit short on time to sleep or whatever it might be, then scheduling in those times to nap is key, especially in and around training. I'm not going to go through these, but I'll keep them on here for you guys to share with you guys later, so you can share with your athletes as well, just on some of the different habits of how you can improve that the sleep. How to track your sleep. And so I know, again, there's tons of things out there. So a few ways that you can do that is there is this app, the CBTI Coach is a really good one, has some good different learnings in there and different tools. So definitely one there that I would suggest. And I know anyone who has watches, again, I know they go based off of movement in your sleep a lot of the times and heart rate. So Apple does a decent job of this, and in terms of their accuracy over here and for the percentage and stuff. So it's not something that is foolproof, and there's a lot of inaccurate data out there. And again, it's something to be careful with athletes seeing their own data. But in general, if they can at least have something, or if they have something that is, they can be more aware for themselves of how much they're getting sleep or how little sleep they're getting. It almost gives them a bit of that feedback for themselves to say, I need a bit more sleep, or I need to focus on this a little bit more. So that is the one good thing, even if the different wearables are different across in terms of their accuracy, at least it gives some, the positive there for them is that they at least get feedback on for themselves. The other way is logging their hours themselves in their training logs. Here are some of the questions that I was referring to earlier that I've used. Is just asking them on a scale of 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, how fatigued do they feel? How stressed do they feel? How well do you think they're sleeping, and the duration. Those would be my top 4 out of all of these that I would at least inquire about to be able to track over time. Because if sleep is going down and stress is very high and fatigue is high, which you'll see often with stress with school, then that's where I can at least track. You can track those over time. All right, so next up is some of the nutrition. So I'm just going to quickly kind of go through this, and most of this is kind of for athlete based, but goals for nutrition here is really refueling. So getting their carbohydrates in, repair, so that regeneration, looking at your proteins, getting the right hydration, so fluids, and then your revitalize, so your vitamins and minerals. Making sure that, again, these are individualized based on what their training is. Let's go ahead here. So, looking at the nutrition. So again, just individualizing some of these carbohydrates, the proteins, their fluids based on how long they're training and what their training looks like. So the biggest thing with this and on the nutrition guidelines here is helping the athletes be prepared as they get to training, and making sure, and just reminding them to just having their food, bring their foods with them if they're going to a competition or training is going to be a long day, making sure they have food with them, making sure they have fluids ready as well. So all things, again, mostly athlete controlled, but as the coach, you can help kind of give these reminders and educate them on these things as well. So back to some of the other recovery modalities, just to kind of finish up on these. There is quite a bit out there. Obviously with the hydrotherapy, the compression, the massage. The one I'm going to just quickly touch on right now is the active recovery and cool down. So I'll show you quickly, just kind of on a scale here, just a summary of some of the different, the high evidence versus low evidence versus the green is one that athletes are often using. Versus on the far right is the high evidence. So you'll see the nutrition, the active recovery, and the sleeping being on the high evidence side of things. So the number one thing I would do in terms of, or suggest and think about with athletes in terms of educating them is that the cool down. So what we're trying to do during that cool down is that aerobic exercises. We're really trying to return that body back to that resting state as fast as we can. And we know that there's going to be an increased lactate production at the end of a hard training session or at the end of a competition. And so that aerobic recovery, really going into that, essentially that aerobic or zone 1, zone 2, you can help remove that lactate and other metabolic waste productions that are happening. And so I'm just going to quickly show you a report that I did with the Thunder Bay group. We went out and they did a time trial, and you can see here at the top, so or on this graph on the left here, as they went out, this athlete here, they're at the very end, we got their lactate was pretty high, around 15.5. But then every 5 minutes we had them go and we just had them do a recovery flush. So just doing a roll on their own at a recovery pace for them. And every 5 minutes we took their lactate and their heart rate. And you can see it still took about 20 minutes for them to come down to a full back to their essentially recovery lactates to 2.4. And in fact, this athlete here was about 25 minutes to really get below 2. And this was across, I think we did almost 6 athletes, and all of them, there was maybe one who took 15 minutes and the rest were around that 20 minutes. So really what this kind of brought to our attention, to the group and to the athletes, to show them was that they actually need to be able to do more of that aerobic recovery longer after a hard competition. And so this brings up, I've been to some of the competitions with the group out in Ottawa, and really in between sprint heats or events is understanding how much time do you have in between that next event, and how much can you get back onto your skis, and or do some sort of active recovery in between to be able to quickly recover for that next session. We're getting low on time here probably, so I'm just gonna quickly go through this. So knowing even on the next side of things on the psychological recovery, so different types of relaxation exercise. So you have your mindfulness, breathing, different exercises there to help increase that parasympathetic activity. I just wanted to leave you with a few things at the end here. This was a quote from one of the coaches. He's with the running group. So here he says, you've got to have the mental toughness. You got to have the mental toughness and confidence in yourself, where you believe that you can take those days off, and you can recover, and you can run great. A lot of what we see in athletes that just train all the time and never give themselves adequate recovery is often portrayed as toughness. But what I've realized over the years is it is a weakness. It's an insecurity that you're not good enough to recover like other athletes. I'm not good enough to do that. I need to keep training. I can't take time off. I can't take easy days. And so that really just comes down to having the confidence, one, for you and the athletes need to have the confidence in the training plan and themselves to be able to take that time off. And you'll often see with athletes that are a little bit more insecure in terms of their performance, is they're going to keep training, they're going to overtrain because they think they need to. And it's really hard for athletes to take those days off, take that time off during the recovery weeks. And so really just trying to give that confidence to them and educate them on the fact that how important those recovery days really are in terms of taking that off, and that their performance will improve later if they do take those days. And then just finally here, just some of that go back to the start in terms of that bad stress, good stress, and some of the different ways that you can de-stress and help with some of that. So obviously you have some of those bad stress moments where there are things in life that are going to happen, and there's the good stress obviously with the training and everything that you're putting on them. And so just finding those ways in terms of recovery to help with the de-stressing. And final thing here, you can ask the athletes. I always ask them to go kind of ask themselves these questions here. Many of the things we talked about today, just in terms of the nutrition, the sleep, the proactive healthcare, so getting massages and physios on their own. And if they say no to any one of these, then they really can't be first go to the coaches and blame those training programs that they're not getting better or they're not improving and they're always fatigued if they aren't taking care of the basics of themselves. But at the same time, I would say the same thing to all of you as coaches, is to really look back at your training programs and make sure that, one, you are taking care of things and the things that you can control as a coach, and scheduling in those regen weeks into the program and really helping the athletes schedule their time as well. I will end it there if anyone has any questions.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone putting up their hand or putting on their video to put up their hand, or not seeing anything in the chat, but thank you very much, Melissa. And as you already mentioned, you'll be happy to share your presentation, as some of the slides were a bit fast. And we are recording this webinar, and that will be available as well. So thank you very much. And Peter, we have some comments here. Amazing info, thanks Melissa. And then, what is a good standby amount of time to recover from an interval intensity session.
So is that like, do you mean in the interval session itself or days following?
Peter, just unmute yourself and you can speak directly. Okay, no, the amount of time to spend in zone 1 the next day.
I mean, I think that probably a little bit of a loaded question in that I would go back to see in terms of how much volume has been done up to that point too. But I mean, I think in general, like it would depend on how, like I think you're right in that you'd be spending that next day doing some zone 1 work, but how much you've done leading into that week, I would look at first and foremost, and then kind of go from there if it's a shorter or longer zone 1 type of day.
Okay, another question. Do heart rate zones change over time? Does an athlete need to have the zones tested once in a while to make sure the watch is accurate? Is there a good method to find these zones?
Yeah, definitely. So in general, what I normally do with, I'll give kind of an example with the group in Thunder Bay with Timo. So we would do these training, a testing session at the beginning of that kind of off season. So as they start to get going again, so you get a kind of a start for those training zones, and then a few months into the summer, so usually kind of mid-summer to end of summer, we would do it again just to reevaluate, because those training zones, like you said, will shift as your training progresses.
All right, I'm not seeing anything else. So thank you so much, Melissa, for your time and energy and sharing all your expertise with us. Thank you.
No problem. And I'll send those slides, like you said, out to...
Yeah, just send them to me and I will forward it to everyone that's attending here.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so we are moving on to talking a little bit about safe sport, and I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, and I do not wish to just speak on my own here for the next little while. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Google Meet does not have all the tools and that Zoom would provide. So I need you to maybe put your video on if you're comfortable. It doesn't have one of these hand signals that Zoom has. So I need you to put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question or speak. And I really encourage you to participate in this. And we certainly can use the chat, but when I'm presenting, I can't actually see the chat. So I would really appreciate if you could engage with me here as I'm going through some of the changes or additions in our Safe Sport progress. As you can imagine, and as you know from media, etc., it basically changes almost daily. And what I'm covering here now is exclusive of COVID, which we can't quite do at the moment, but any of the guidelines that have been developed do not take COVID into consideration. And Liz, our COVID expert, has done a tremendous job on getting us back into our sport. And so please make sure you check our website. It has a COVID tab. And I know with the increasing numbers now, things are getting more complicated. So we're trying our best to keep you informed and answer your questions on the COVID side. But as far as safe sport is concerned, any of the guidelines that have been developed have not taken our current situation into consideration. Nonetheless, it's important that we have open communication about safe sport. And I've been involved in this topic for the past 3 years, been on many different task forces for the ministry. Currently, I'm with Nordic Canada on another task force to develop some further guidelines, and it is changing constantly. And I'm happy to say that Ontario has done a great job in getting started on it anyway. So at the moment, I'm going to start with one of the trainings that has been mainly focused for coaches, but I do have to point out that in this task force I'm on right now with Nordic Canada, there's quite a mix of people are part of it, and some of them are athletes, and it kind of became more evident how important it is that our athletes are just as aware of our safe sport topic as coaches. And basically, we want to keep everyone in the sport safe, whether it's officials, even board members, anyone who's really part of our sport. So I've been looking into training modules. There are 4 out there that are prevalent, which is the safe sport training from the Coaches Association of Canada. Then there is the Commit to Kits, which XCSO had put a little push on last year, and we had some licenses for clubs to use for their members. And so safe sport training, Commit to Kits, making ethical decisions, which most of you will have done through your coach education. That's also through the Coaching Association of Canada. And then there's respect in sport. And I just was working with Stephen Novosad from Nordic Canada to make that an option as well, so that it's available for, I guess it's activity leaders, which would be coaches, to take. Obviously, we can't expect all our coaches, volunteers to take 4 different modules. So at the moment, I would endorse the safe sport training through the CAC. And I'm going to share my screen now to show you that safe sport from the CAC. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, can you see the safe sport in the locker? Can someone, as I can't see the chat, can someone verify that? Anyone?
Yes, Katja, we can see it.
Thank you. Perfect. So all of you will have or do have a locker account. If you don't, get in touch with me and I can help you with that. And you will see in the e-learning tab, there's the safe sport training. And it takes about 90 minutes to complete. It is free and it is for everyone. Athletes, coaches, officials, etc., sports administrators. So please encourage your coaches in your club to take this module. I know that Nordic Canada's coaches, it's mandatory to take, and it's probably not going to be long that it's going to be mandatory in our province as well. So get a head start during COVID to complete this safe sport training. It really is quite enlightening, and it's important that we are aware of what's going on there. Okay. Oops. That didn't work out. There we go. Okay. And the other thing I do want to go through is on our website, you can see that we have a Safe Sport tab as well. And I'm going to go through that because I want to make sure, if you haven't taken the time to look through that part, that we quickly take a peek at it now. So, Safe Sport. You can see at the top, there is the tab for Safe Sport. And there are a number of different guidelines on there. And I would like to go through the responsible coaching guideline very briefly because we had an addition to that we just made in the last month. So it's important that your clubs are taking time to look through these guidelines, as it gives good information to what you would have to put or what you should put in place at your club to make sure you're keeping everyone safe. Rule of 2, I get lots of questions that what do we do if we only have one coach or 2 coaches of the same gender? And to have a brief answer to that, you can use or you can put in place a volunteer or a chaperone who is present with you as the coach in a situation where you are with just the one athlete. So there are ways that you can put yourself into a safe position if you can't completely adhere to these rule of 2 guidelines. It's even safer if you have 2 screened or trained coaches, but you can absolutely have a parent or another volunteer present. So there's information on the different code of conducts, what you should be background screening your volunteers for. There is information on, and a very useful graph here with what you should be getting from your coaches, volunteers, in terms of screening. And I'll get to what this actually looks like in reality for you at your clubs shortly. I do want to get to our new addition. So there are the trainings I was talking about that you can ask your coaches in the clubs to take. I still have to add the Safe Sport training and the Respect in Sport module. But the new part is reporting and documentation. So that we just added in September. And basically, we've been very fortunate, I would say, in our club that we haven't had too many incidents that we're aware of. But we need to have some guidelines in place that basically what happens if there is a situation that is uncomfortable or you're not sure what to do with, you're witnessing something that you're just not sure how to handle. So we have gone into the reporting and documentation part to make that easier for everyone to follow some guidelines. So we do have an incident report that you would fill in, and that would come to Liz or myself. And that's, if you follow the link, you will see the incident report. And if you're witnessing something, it's important that you put that in writing. If it's just a verbal, oh, I saw that, that is very difficult to handle, as it can be considered, using that term, gossip or whatever. It is something that if you do see something you're uncomfortable, please put that into the report form, and then we will, as an organization, take the next steps. Now, it sounds like that's can be a pretty big step to take. And what we're really aiming for is that we're creating an environment in our sport that makes talking about safe sport comfortable, so that you don't feel like, oh, I'm ratting out on a friend of mine who I've been coaching with forever, and I may not have all the necessary background information. So we're working on creating an environment where you're comfortable to maybe go up to that coach and say, hey, I saw such and such behavior. How come? And so that you're opening up the conversation, that you're able to basically talk to the coach directly. And so it wouldn't have to necessarily go to that next step. So that's our first step, is to create that environment that we're comfortable talking about issues like, is it okay to hug an athlete coming across the finish line? That's a conversation we have to have. And we're trying our best that you are comfortable sharing that. And basically, that's the environment we're working on. And I've had many clubs actually that have been part of implementing this with tons of questions, because not every club has the same scenarios, has the same number of coaches. And it's important that you feel comfortable talking about it, giving me a call. I've been on board meetings. We've got some clubs that actually have a board member now that is responsible for safe sport only, to make sure that they're doing the right thing to keep everyone safe. It's not just something we read in the newspaper or hear in the media. It's something that we have to take very seriously. And it can be overwhelming to sort of even look at yourself and think, am I without knowing potentially putting someone into a situation that is uncomfortable? And I really think it's important that we look at, as coaches, look at our athletes first, and understand that they are often in a developing phase where they may be okay one day with something, and then the next day they may not be. So it's important, to ask permission to give someone a hug or things like that, because we just don't know how they necessarily feel, and they may not be able to verbalize that. So I think it's important that we recognize the sort of, I hate the word power that we have, but we do. And so we have to make sure that we are extremely careful with how we interact with athletes as well as everyone else. So I would like to open the floor if you have any questions with regards to how to implement that at your club, or any questions of situations that could help other clubs. So we want to make sure that that information can be shared, so to create that environment as much as privacy allows us to do so. So please write in the chat or put your video on and raise your hand if you have anything you would like to.
Question.
Yes.
The report, if does a person have the option to remain somewhat anonymous, or do they have to reveal who they are? Will the person being reported know who did the reporting?
No.
Okay.
Not necessarily. It really depends how easily resolved the situation can be. So if you just witness something that you're uncomfortable with, and that person reporting it can talk through that with XCSO and see, basically see what steps can be taken, then that can be anonymous. Also, it can be, so XCSO is basically sort of the middleman, can approach that person and say that it was reported that. So it's definitely a possibility to do that. I mean, it depends. I mean, if it was very clearly that two people were there and an incident gets reported, then it's pretty hard to keep that anonymous. It depends on the setting, really.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, Katja, it's Eric.
Hi.
How's it going? Question, or like a little bit of something I've tried to launch at our club with respect to personal communication. So I know with the rule of two training and stuff that we did, there was a big part around individual private communication, whether that be a text or email or something. I just wanted to get your take and maybe other people's experiences. What we tried to do is when athletes get, like to a little bit a high school age, if it's someone who's sort of a high performance athlete that seems like it might be appropriate to have some sort of not personal conversations, but one-on-one conversations, to have a form that we create, which brings the parents and everybody into the loop, that basically says, we are aware that there may be one-on-one communication via, let's say, WhatsApp we've been using. And we are okay with that. Everybody signs it. I sign it. The president signs it. The athlete signs it. The parent signs it. And then as part of that, there's a record kept. So at any point, if there was anything going on, any party can request basically, a written copy of the correspondence between the athlete and the coach. I know that wasn't part of the training, but it is something that we are working with to try to make a workable solution, not to get around the rules, but, you hear of these extreme examples like the Kyle Schufelt example that they use in the training, where one coach asked if they were getting over their injury and they were fired from his gym in Calgary. So, I think there are some things where if I'm just saying, hey, are you coming to training tonight? We don't feel the need necessarily to loop in a parent. I just guess I thought I'd get your take on that. And so that everyone, it's all above the table, and that there's a record kept that on both phones, basically.
Thank you, Eric. That's an excellent question, and you're doing an excellent job with that, because ultimately it's all about transparency and sort of risk management. We can't have the perfect solution for every single situation in general. So you're like, what you're doing is absolutely great, because you're keeping a record. It's all very transparent. And as far as like individual text messaging, I mean, again, it's sometimes very difficult for for us coaches, because our personality can be stumping us at times when you want to, you know, just say have a great evening or whatever. Like, it's really hard sometimes to stick to just being professional. Basically, you're the coach. So where you just have to be really careful is to keep that sort of personal voice at a limit. But what you're doing in terms of transparency is absolutely great and more than acceptable. And I think also when we first started with the safe sport sort of topic, it had a lot of reaction. Oh, we can shut down our course because our team, because we don't have the resources to comply with all of this. And that's obviously not what we're aiming for. And again, transparency is sort of the answer. I mean, we need to avoid coaches traveling with athletes on their own at all costs. But sometimes there are situations where you're not going to leave someone on the side of the road if they're stranded for whatever reason, and you're not going to just drive by and say, sorry, can't take you. Like, there are circumstances where you have to use common sense, and basically we're trying to help you find the best way to deal with that. So again, that you're making sure that if you have a situation where an athlete has to be transported, you could basically have the conversation, or what you're doing with a letter to the parents at the beginning of the season, of the training year, that these are the circumstances that our club has. This is what we are dealing with, and have that exact open communication that you are talking about, Eric. So I think that's great, because we can't completely at all times adhere to these rules.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
So I do encourage you to look at within your club to see where are you at with that, and those implementing those guidelines. Is there someone that you could, I hate the word task with, but kind of put in charge of taking a little bit of a poll on how things are in your own club, and see if there's a way that you can make that a topic and implement those guidelines. And I mean, it is work. It's an extra volunteer who would have to basically keep track of criminal record checks and all of that. So I'm aware that we're asking a lot of our volunteers already, but if there's a board member who could take that on, we really are not looking at this as something extra. It's something crucial. It's something that we, unfortunately, in our world today, have to take very seriously. So I encourage more clubs to come forward and reach out and say, how can we do this? Help us. That's part of my job, and I'm more than happy to talk through it with you and see what is possible with the limited resources you might have. But we really have to make this a priority. And do we have any more questions now, or am I expecting to get a ton of emails after this presentation? I'd love to hear from you, and love to help in any way to get you on board with this.
I have another question.
Yes, please.
The the rule of two, does it pertain visually? For instance, there's about a 300-meter area where we could be skiing together, where everyone would see everyone essentially. Is it okay to be one-on-one in a situation like that?
That's a very good question. Basically, that's an answer to if you don't have another person for whatever reason, if you're a coach and only one athlete and from the opposite gender shows up to practice, and you had all this sort of practice planned in the backwoods of like ski striding or what have you, and now it's okay, it's just a male coach with a female athlete or the other way around, and what do you do? So that's a good answer. Be in a public area where it's visible to, let's say at a ski club, where in front of the clubhouse, and where people can see. It's not necessary to cancel your practice. Again, it depends on the people involved. Like if it's an athlete that is kind of sensitive to potentially that scenario, then you may say, hey, let's reconvene another time. But you certainly could alter your practice and do something, strength training in front of the clubhouse or something like that, if that's possible. And you could also go into the clubhouse, and if there's someone available to keep an eye on what's going on out there, that could be your second volunteer or person that would be available to be there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but then it leads into another part. I'm often one-on-one because I'm usually with a disabled athlete,
right?
And then sometimes we want to go ski off somewhere, and then we're not necessarily visible anymore. And so I guess that's where I have to have another person with me.
Yes, that would certainly be the answer. If you could find someone, even, I don't know your setting, but if it could be even another older athlete that would appreciate the outing, just anyone else who would go with you, that would be the best case answer. Now, if your setting is such that, again, I'm not sure of this particular setting, but again, transparency, if that happens and the parents of that athlete are aware of this, or even the team, there could be certainly circumstances where just the transparency is the best case scenario. But yeah, if you can avoid that the optics of it are a big thing that we also have to be aware of, so that we can avoid any difficult situation. If you have a choice to have someone with you, then that would be the best choice.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay. Last chance for questions. Okay, hearing and seeing none. Hopefully hearing from you by email at some point. Anytime, reach out. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce our last presenter, and that is Paul Hemsworth. And he is working in the integrated support team for our NTDC athletes in Thunder Bay. And he is a strength and conditioning expert and many other things. And Paul, welcome. And he is going to be taking us through an active session of mobility and stability, if I have that right. So I'm looking forward to getting out of my chair, and I hope you all are as well. And I'm going to pass it on to Paul. Thank you very much for being here.
And there we go. Sorry about that. Rookie on the Google meetups here. So thank you very much for having me. And I know there's a lot more people than are on my screen. So sorry if I can't see you all, but glad that everybody could be here. And yeah, I thought, first of all, can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody see my my paint cans in the background there? All good? I was going to do this at the gym, and then I realized I wanted to roll right into bed afterwards, so I thought I'd do it in my basement. So hopefully we can keep this pretty light, but practical as well. So if you're able, we can go through some movements together. But I want it to be sort of led by, obviously I've got a framework here, but I want to sort of meet the needs of everybody, and if there's questions to run with those as well. So hopefully we'll be about an hour or so, but try and leave room for questions. And if people want to go in a different direction with it, we totally can do that as well. Obviously there's a lot of people on the call. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about was one of the big things, and when I was speaking in Ottawa, for those of you that were there, we were talking a lot about sort of the prerequisites at the stages of development for strength, and for when, you know, athletes come to see myself and other coaches on the National Training Development Center level, and then above that and going into higher levels. By the time they come to see us, they are already at a stage where they need to be able to do a certain amount of things. And that the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think for a lot of you who are coaches, especially at club levels for younger athletes, I think this is like the big thing that I'm noticing, is that the movement is not there like it would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly 50, 60 years ago at the same age group. So by the time they come into their late teens, early 20s, a lot of their potential from a movement standpoint has essentially been, you know, experienced already. And what we need to understand is how much we can shape that in the early stages, and how much we need to start to change the way we look at movement. And you'll notice I'm using that term a lot, because I think we get focused in on strength training, which is obviously super important. It's a big part of what I do. It's the main thing what I do, but it is completely based on whether or not the athlete can move well. You can only get an athlete so strong in a poor range of motion, a poor movement foundation. So I think a lot of what we'll talk about today and kind of go through today is ways that I'm looking at trying to change that, but then also work with each of you to be able to establish something, a movement protocol, a daily ritual, and depending on what level, what age group the athletes are at, sort of looking at what's important at those stages. And at the last conference in Ottawa, I think I had some slides, so hopefully those could be shareable as well again, just to look at what those prerequisites are at each stage. And just to give everyone a heads up as to what I'm looking for, beforehand, if that can be done before they get to me, there's a lot less undoing that has to be done. And it's a lot harder to undo those things when they get into their late teens, early 20s, and then onwards. The body is starting to take quite a good shape as to how it's going to look. Doesn't mean that we can't impact that body anymore. It can't change the range of motion, can't change the hardware, but it's a lot harder to do at that stage than early on. So early on, what we're looking for is athleticism, basically looking at range of motion, body awareness, athleticism, in a broad range of movement patterns in a broad range of sports, and that's where specificity sort of gets in the way of that. So and then moving upwards, we're looking at more specific things that we need to be able to do. They need to be able to squat really well. They need to be able to learn how to deadlift and push and pull, and they have to have obviously some stability, but that can be built. That stuff is a lot easier to do once the athletes actually can move well and freely. So everybody's going to be different there, and you can't push the same program on every athlete, obviously, but we also have to realize that in some ways, based on the amount of resources we have, that sometimes those programs are going to have to be given out, and then sort of tailor them a little bit more to that individual athlete and their needs. So mobility to me is one of the biggest missing pieces, and I think that's what we'll spend the first little bit on in sort of my philosophy on mobility. And just to give you guys just a quick sort of definition, I guess, of mobility, we're looking at active range of motion. So if we look at flexibility as being, very broadly speaking, more of a passive range or flexibility of the muscles themselves, then mobility is actually looking at that plus an active range. So the ability to close the gap between active and passive is really what we're looking for. And if we can have that gap be closed, we have more control over the body and the movement. So so with mobility, that means that we have to work in passive stretching, but we also have to work in force. We have the cells of the body need to understand the joints, need to use force as the language, right? So we have to get creative with how we utilize that, and so hopefully today we can cover some of that. One of the things that we get all the athletes to do is what we call controlled articular rotations, or CARs for short. And CARs are that is something that was sort of created by Dr. Andrea Spina through the functional range and functional range conditioning, functional range systems, and it is basically there's a lot more literature on this, but basically it's looking at joint circles at every joint every single day at a very minimum once a day, and then using it as a warm-up as well. But it's an assessment tool for us to see where each joint is and whether or not that joint moves independently of any other joint. And that's the true definition of a joint, is the ability to move freely without using other joints to compensate for that. So we often think that we have a certain range of motion at a shoulder, and if I use my spine to rotate that shoulder, I can look like I have a big range at that shoulder, but now I'm using my spine to do it because I don't actually have the range at my shoulder. And if I'm trying to do a movement pattern, I'm going to do that movement pattern any way I can. So this is where we see people that come in with back pain all the time, and we immediately think there's something wrong with the spine, there's something wrong with the core, it's not firing, blah, 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 the usual suspects. And we get the person to flex their shoulder, and they get to about here. So if they're gonna reach up overhead, well, they have to now bend through their back to get there. And lo and behold, they have low back pain all the time, and all we did was check the range of the shoulder. So in a very simple way, that's what we're trying to get at, is to say, okay, let's see if that joint can move the way it's supposed to move. Does it have the control of that range? And then can we expand upon that so that we can build in strength within that new range? Okay, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it's very incremental as we go, but that's the idea. So CARs are a way that we actually see where each joint is at. We're actually building in afferent information to the nervous system to be able to tell the brain where that joint is in space right now, how it's moving. We're giving it input daily, saying this is important, this is important. So when the cells turn over every couple of years, they're going to turn over with that information, and it's going to be useful information for that person. If the person doesn't move that joint and doesn't move it much at all, or sits in a desk all day long, then that's going to be the information that gets sent to the brain, and the cells turn over with that information. So we actually are capable of changing over time. We just need to put the inputs into the system. Okay, so maybe we'll start with that, and then we'll get into a little bit of the CARs right now. is everybody game for doing a little bit of movement? see some yawns. Maybe we can wake up a little bit. Okay, so we'll get everybody. You can either actually stand or kneel if you don't have a lot of space. Kneeling's fine as well. Some of this can be done from a chair if that needs to be done. That's totally fine. And realize that, you know, if you can't do it all, don't try and do it all. Do what you can, and any kind of movement is good movement here. So yeah, I'll stand up and we can get started there. So some of the principles for the cars are that we want to see, we'll take the neck as an example. We want to see the neck moving without any other, you know, twisting, shrugging, arching of the back. So the rest of the body, we want to have a little bit of tension in. So you'll see me kind of clench my fists a little bit. That's so that when I'm moving, whatever joint I'm moving, nothing else is moving. So I'm having a little bit of tension with almost every muscle in my body that's not moving, and then we try and let that joint move freely. So that's going to be the first one. We're going to start with their neck. We're going to work our way down, and then after we do all these, maybe we'll field some questions based on that, and then we can go into some stability work after that. Okay. So the cars for the neck is we're going to squeeze the fists. We're going to have a little bit of tension in the stomach, like you're bracing for a punch. Squeeze your butt, squeeze your quads. Everything is nice and tight. And all we're going to do is we're going to draw a circle with the chin. So you're going to drop your chin to your chest, and you're going to rotate your chin towards your shoulder, and then you're going to do whatever circle you can all the way around, all the way to the other shoulder, down to your chest. And take another inhale, and then we're going to go the other way. So chin towards the shoulder, all the way around the back, down towards the other shoulder, and down to the chest again. And we'll just go one more time through each of those directions, and just take note as to what you're feeling when you go through this. Are there any catching points? Are there any points where you have to drop down to get out of the range, to cut the range down? Is there any pain there? Is it easy one way or the other? These are all things you're checking in with, and this is what I get the athletes to do. Is this is a really intentional exercise, is to not just, you know, go through the motions and talk to, you know, your buddies when you're doing this. This is a way to tune into your body, much like an intention of a yoga practice, right? So that is the neck. We're going to go down to the thoracic spine now. So we're looking at that section in that sternum area that we want to move. And this one's a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to simplify it so that we're just getting, essentially, if you think of your vertebrae in your spine, we're getting one rotating on top of the other. So everything below one is stationary, and then that top one is going to be moving. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to cross the shoulders, or the hands on the shoulders, and I'll sort of turn sideways so you can see this from the side, but we're going to take one vertebrae at a time. We're going to drop the chin down, and we're going to round into the shoulders. So as soon as the shoulders start to round, that's where we're going to stop there. And then we're going to twist towards the one side without moving my hips. So I keep my hips stationary, and I just twist my shoulders. I side bend. So I'll just show you here, side bend to here. And then we're going to draw the circle all the way around the back. I side bend to the other side, twist to the other side, and then rotate all the way down to the front. So if you screw up that order, don't worry about it. Just try and think of a circle. So we're going to go twist, side bend, around the back, extending. We side bend or flex, and then twist all the way down to the front. We'll do that one more time where we twist. And again, try and keep the area below the moving part stationary so it doesn't move. Rotate down to the front. And then we're going to twist one more time, side bend, extend all the way around the back, side bend, and down, and there we go. So again, that's the most complicated one. That probably felt a little bit odd, but when you're going back to you're just thinking that one vertebrae is rotating on the top, and you're going to find certain points that want to move more than others. One thing about the spine we know is that when we have good thoracic movement, other things seem to improve. So we get better extension, flexion of the thoracic spine. Everything's moving well, but then we get the shoulder moving well based on the fact that thoracic spine can move. Also, people often that have lower back pain, what we see is that the movement is not here in the thoracic, it's happening at the low back, and we're getting a little bit too much of that movement happening there. So we want all segments of the spine to move, but the lumbar is a little bit more built for stability than mobility, and the thoracic is the other way around. So so now we're going to go to the shoulder blades here. So the scapula are going to move, and this one we can do a bunch of different ways, but we're going to start very simple, just with the hands at the sides here, and they're just on the middle finger on the seam of the pants. And then all we're going to do, without moving the head forward and back or the spine at all, we're going to sit nice and tall. We're going to inhale into the belly. We're going to squeeze every other muscle nice and tight, and we're going to just shrug up towards the ears. We're going to draw back, down, and forward. So from the side, it's up, back, down, forward. We'll do that one more time, up, and try and carve a smoother circle every time you go. And then what we're going to do is reverse that. So we're going to go down, back, up, forward, down, back, up, forward, and one more time. And again, really easy to move your head forward when you retract your scapula back. So pay attention to that as to when that actually might be happening on a regular basis. You can also work on different angles. You can work on one scapula at a time with the arm straight out or at the side. Any angle is going to be fine, but you're going to find different feedback from different angles. It's going to be harder with the arm up and going through a motion at an angle here versus when it's at the side. So if you're really struggling with movement, I would start very simple at the side. If you're trying to challenge that a little bit more, we're going to bring that out, and you can work side to side on those as well. So the next one is going to be the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint itself. So we worked on scapula first. Now we're looking at the actual joint of the ball and socket. The goal on this one is to make sure that we're still maintaining congruency in there. Okay, so you're trying to keep that ball inside the socket the best you can. So I'm going to back up just a little bit so you can see this. Hit my rafters here. So you're going to go with one arm straight out. The other arm is making a fist at your side. So you're going to be starting in this plane here. So you're coming up with the elbow staying straight, and you're going to bring that arm as far back as you can without shrugging the shoulder or bending the elbow. And then you're going to flip the palm so that it's drawing a circle back behind and then all the way down to the side. So when you get to the side, internally rotated, your upper arm's turning inwards and your palm is facing out. So that's internal rotation there. And then you're going to take another belly breath and you're going to pull back into extension. Still, that towel's wrung out, okay? Still coming back, and then we flip, bring the towel the other way, and then we're trying to add it towards your ear as soon as you can, and then back down to the front. So I'll do that from a different plane so you can see that same arm. So we'll do the same shoulder. So we bring that arm up as far as we can towards the ear. We flip the palm, and then we reach back. And you're trying to do this without twisting your chest. That's the big thing here, is that the chest doesn't move. And then another inhale at the bottom. Hold that tension in the stomach tight in the other fist. We come back. And then here again, we flip and don't twist the chest. And you're trying to add towards the ear as soon as you can, and then back down. And we'll try 2 on the other side as well. So again, other fist here, palm facing in. We flex up, far back as we can without compensating. Flip the palm, reach back behind. And then when you get to the bottom, your palm again is facing away. Your arm is internally rotated. And take a big inhale again. Hold that strong, and then we're going to come back, hit that end range, flip the palm, add towards the ear, and back down. One more time, inhale, arm comes back. And then again, as we're going through these, you want to pay attention. Where are the areas that you're struggling? Where are the side-to-side differences that you have that you haven't really noticed that much? And it may be surprising at which side that is. Sometimes the dominant side actually moves worse, but we've just gone to that very frequently and become strong in that side. So that's the shoulder joint. I'm going to quickly go through elbows and wrists because I do think that they're super important, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, especially people working on keyboards a lot. These can be very helpful, but in terms of the wrist, we actually want to have a really mobile wrist for a lot of reasons. Push-ups, front squats, things like that require a requisite amount of wrist extension to be able to load. And if you don't have that, you're just forcing that. So that's what we're going to go through here. So I just have, for the elbow, I just have my hand right against my elbow here so it doesn't move forward and back. And I'm just going to flex up. This is a pretty simple one, but we flex up as high as we can with the bicep squeezing. And then we're going to flip the palm open as much as we can. So we're going to rotate as much as we can open, bring it back down, and we're going to keep it there, come back up, and then we're going to flip here. So we go down, back up, flip, down, back up, and flip. And we'll just do that other side as well. Just again to feel if there's been any injuries or again any patterns where we're not getting a good rotation. This is the forearm rotating in the elbow. Okay, so that and we can also rotate at the bottom and just do come up and down and rotate at the bottom as well. So you're going to hit something a little bit different there. But I do want to go to the wrist here. Again, because the wrist it's like the ankle in a way where you don't think of it too much, but it actually has a big role in your lifting as well as just overall function, especially with skiers with double pulling. They're getting a lot of overuse in there. So we want to make sure it's moving well. So I usually just hold my forearm flat here and don't let it move. The movement is all happening in the hand, so at the wrist itself. And then we're just going to do a turn towards the pinky and then come down around the bottom and then work on big of a circle as you can without that forearm twisting. You're going to want to see that forearm rotate. Don't let it move. Stay flat. So we're just drawing a circle one way. We'll do about 3. And it's probably a little bit grindy on the corners. And then we'll reverse that so we go the other way. So again, this is not just about the size of the circle that you can create. It's about how much control and smoothness you have of that circle. So that's one way we can measure progression is how much control and how smooth the circle is. We'll do the other side as well, the other wrist. So pinky and then extending down and around. We'll do about 3 slow. And another thing about these is we want to keep them pretty slow at first because you want to be able to notice when things are actually changing. Sometimes when we go too quickly, we realize, oh, the forearm's been twisting the whole time and I haven't noticed it. Same thing with core stability is that when we're rushing the core stability, we don't notice when we're compensating. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. So that is essentially upper body. There's a spine one that I'll show you I think at the end here, but I want to get into the hips a little bit here. For the hips, you're going to need something. You can do this standing, freestanding, but I would say the best thing to do is to hang out on a wall or a beam or something if you have it. And what we're doing is very similar to what we were doing with the shoulder, but at the hip. So I'm holding on one side, and I'm going to move my outside hip, and I usually just keep my other fist up and out of the way. But it's also going to create tension. So I'm pulling down with the beam on my right hand here, and my left hand's up nice and solid. So staying nice and tall on the one side, I'm bringing my knee up as high as I can into hip flexion, and I'm doing that without bending my other knee. Oftentimes we'll kind of bend into it here and flex into it. You're trying to pull that knee up as high as you can, and then we're bringing the knee out without moving that hip with it. So we don't want the opposite hip to start to rotate in. We bring that out as far as we can. Now here is the fun part. So this is where we get internal rotation, where we bring that shin back around, and then we draw back to the beginning there. Now I'm going to go the other way. So I'm going to go heel back into extension. And when I do that, it's really easy to go into a big back arch. Okay, what we're trying to do is we're just going back until that hip flexor gets tight. It's not arching my back. I'm keeping my rib cage solid. Then I'm going to flare my knee out to the side, and then I'm going to rotate that shin in and then up and back around. So again, we'll do that one more time. So we go knee up, abduction, internal rotation, and then adduction and back in. And then I'm going to extend my hip back, and then I abduction away. I externally rotate my hip so the shin comes down, and then I bring my knee up and around. Okay, so that's the one hip. We'll do the other. This is the one that's probably one of the most challenging for most people to do, especially in that internal rotation. So the other side, we go, knee comes up, out, shin goes back, draw that circle with the knee all the way around. And again, I'm trying to stay as tall as I can, rib cage down. Inhale, I go back, out, and then knee comes up and around. And I'll do that one more time. So flex up, abduction out, internal rotation, abduction extension, and then all the way in. And then we go extension, abduction, external rotation, flexion, and adduction. Okay. So the next one, it can be done from a chair, but probably best done on the ground. But if you need to go to the chair, that's totally fine. So this one is for the knee. So we're going to go knee and then ankle, and then we'll go through the spine one at the end, and then we'll take a break. So again, if you need to do this in a chair, totally fine. You're just going to kind of lean back, and you're going to hold the one knee. Actually, I'll just demo this from there because it's probably easiest for everybody. So this one here, you just want to make sure, because you're sitting in a chair, normally if you're on the ground, your other leg would be straight out. So just make sure that you're tall through your spine here and you're not just rounding, okay? And you're sitting with a good normal arch in your low back. So from there, we're going to bring this knee up to wherever we can. You're not bringing it as high as you can yet. You're going to let that down a little bit. So what we want here is we actually want the shin to rotate. We don't want the thigh to rotate. This is what happens when we have no movement at the knee. There's not a lot, but when there is none, the whole thigh moves the shin, right? So we want to hold that. We're going to turn the toes out. So again, I sometimes take my hand on my shin and I rotate it out. I actually physically move that and feel my shin rotate out. And then I'm going to try and straighten my leg as high as I can into as straight of a knee as I can. And then I'm going to come back down as far as I can. And then I'm going to rotate in. And if I need to do that with my hand again, I rotate in. I come up, back down, rotate out. And this is much like the elbow, where we can rotate at the bottom, and then we can rotate at the top. So now we'll come up, rotate out, down, up, rotate in, down. And at this point here, you're not going to get a ton of rotation when your knee's straight versus when your knee's bent, okay? But you're trying to work that, and you'll notice that there's an active hamstring stretch on that as well. Obviously, we're going to as much extension as we can, and once we get that knee fairly straight, you're going to feel that hamstring screaming pretty good. So that's why we can adjust the leg. If I can't get anywhere near straight, then I'm going to lower that down a little bit so that I can get that leg out a bit, okay? So sort of meeting the person where they are. So we'll go to the other side there just a few times just to notice that difference. So turning out, up, turning in and up, and just going through that a couple times. And then we'll just do a couple at the top here where we come up, turn in, up, turn out, just so you can feel that. So that's the knee, and again, also just working on active hamstring motion as well. So the last one here we're going to do is the ankle. So that we wanted the shin to move last time. This time we don't want the shin to move. So it's sort of holding onto that shin and drawing a circle now with sort of the big toes. So we pull the toes up towards the shin, and then we're going to turn out and point away all the way around the bottom, all the way around the corner, and then you're pulling your toes up towards your shin, okay? So we're going, and then we're going to reverse that, and nice and slow like this, so you can notice when the corners want to drop your foot down really, really quickly, and jaggedy. What we're trying to do is smooth that circle out as much as we can and open up the circle as big as we can without moving the shin at all. So we'll try the other side there after you've done about 2 each way. Again, the ankle, I can't talk enough about the ankle because of its role in so many different things, especially with the squat. So if the ankle's not moving, especially in dorsiflexion, by pulling the toes up towards your shin, then the squat is going to suffer. What we're going to see is that you're going to want to hinge more at your hips, more like a deadlift. And if the goal is to squat, that's going to put a lot of strain at areas that we don't want. So the ankle needs to be able to move really well in order to be able to sit nicely into that squat. That's going to be one aspect of the squat. The squat's got a lot of things happening there, but if the ankles aren't moving, we need to get them moving. And that's going to affect the skiing as well, especially from a pulling the toe up standpoint. So a lot of compartment syndrome issues and things like that with pulling the skis back. We go back and we look at how that ankle is moving. We can work on that at a young age and make sure that that's something that we're building moving forward. So that was in a nutshell. Oh, the cars. I'm going to demo one more. You don't have to do this one, but I'm just going to show it to you just so you know what's going on with the spine. Is we do like a cat camel. So the idea with the spine here is that we're getting segmental movement one at a time. So the way we'll do that is we'll round into a full flexion position. And I'm going to start imagining that somebody's walking their fingers along my spine, and I'm going to avoid their fingers the first part. So I go from flexion, I'm avoiding their fingers and going into extension. So I'm starting flexed here, and I go nice and slow all the way down the spine. And I'm trying to just move one at a time until I get into full extension at both. And then I'm going to take my tailbone again, and I'm going to start there. And I'm going to now push into the fingers when they walk along. So again, trying not to move the upper as the lower moves. So that's one round. And then the second round, I'm going to start with my head at both ends. So I'm going to go head into extension first. And then once I get there, now I'm going to finish off with head all the way down to the tailbone. So again, sort of a cat-cow, cat-camel position, but a segmental one rather than just a broad movement. So we're looking at, again, the ability to extend one at a time. And what we find with that one as well is that when we get better to lumbar and pelvic movement happening there, we see hamstring function improve as well, just because of the articulation of the hamstrings and where they attach. So again, something that is bringing in input into the system, it's giving us feedback right away. We can use that. This one took probably, 15, 20 minutes. Normally that's going to take 5 to 10. We'll use it as a morning ritual. So morning movement routine, and then a warm up for our lifting sessions as well. Before anything else, we're going to start with that. And then I suggest that they just do that as much as possible. It doesn't take a lot of time. And if you can establish a routine there, then that's going to be carried with them for life, especially the younger they are, right? And if we can start to practice less dry land training of movements that are, let's call them shitty movements, a lot of times, doing a lot of things poorly. If we get out of that and we go into, let's establish quality movement patterns early on and make that the norm and get them excited about that, then we can start to build some serious performance off of that. Okay, it's really hard to undo that later on. So that's the first part. I just wanted to show you that. Does anybody have any questions for that portion right now? Anything to do with mobility, some of the stuff that we're doing, or specific to the cars that we just went through? Sorry, I think there was a question.
Can you see it, Paul, or do you want to read it to you?
I saw it for a second and then I lost it.
What would be some examples of shitty motions we should avoid?
Oh, nice. How much time do we have? Yeah, so the biggest one we see at a young age with sort of dry land is like things like push-ups and sit-ups till no end, like just thinking that the more is better at a young age, and there's a point at which that is an okay thing to do. But again, normally speaking, when we get like really good athletes coming in and they do a proper push-up, they're probably not going to be able to actually do more than something like 25 at a really high level. The athletes that are younger probably can't do one well, and I'm being honest in the sense that their bodies are all over the place. They're loading their joints in very poor ways. They're not actually developing stability. They're developing like again, that quote that I keep coming back to is practice makes permanence. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. So what they're practicing carries with them. And what you need to understand too is that a bad push-up is going to show up in a double pull. It's going to show up in a pull-up. It's going to show up in a squat. All those things that are happening within the body are patterns that are showing up everywhere because we're programming that to be normal. So at a young age, if you're doing that and you're saying, okay, just, we're going to see how many push-ups we can do in a minute, we need to get out of that mentality. We need to actually teach them how to have strong, resilient joints, and then how to do a push-up well, and to realize that the push-up's not the be-all and end-all. That might be used sparingly, right? It might be used for some a lot more than others. It's still a great upper body strength exercise, but generally speaking, when a person, especially say a post-puberty boy, they probably aren't moving all that well. They might get a lot tighter once they've hit puberty. They might tighten up a lot, and you might see that a range out of shoulder ends up being like here, and then they're into here to try and get that full range. And when they're on the ground like that with gravity coming down on them, it's just it's just a recipe for disaster, because that's also the prerequisite for like a bench press or a chest press of some sort. So that will show up in that, and now we're loading that with weight as well, right? So now we're probably in the physio's office a lot more than we want to be. The other thing too, like air squats and things, but air squats can be good if the squat is taught well, if it's developed, if it's worked over time and it's progressed from a young age all the way up. And you see this in other countries a lot more. In China, we're not developing weightlifters, professional weightlifters, but you have to understand that if you were to develop a weightlifter, that what they would be doing is they would have these progressions that they're shooting for, and it's not always like how much weight can I put on the bar. It's like what kind of range can I get to? What's happening at my hips at this age? How is my spine moving through this part of the motion? All these things. How much stability do I have in my scapula? Those are the bench markers we should be looking at more, and then realizing, okay, once a person can hold a good position for a period of time, body weight, and has the prerequisite range at the ankles, knees, hips, and spine to be able to get there, then now it's okay. Now we can look at starting to load that up, whether we're looking at repetitions or we're looking at load. So hopefully that makes sense, because it's really, I think, a bit of a mind shift to where we need to go for that. Any other questions?
Are there shitty stretches that we should be avoiding?
Okay. Yeah, and it's one of these hard things that, an hour of a practical session is no time at all, to mix sort of theory and practical, to really get at, the details of this. I would say that if an individual, especially a younger athlete, is stretching, I'm not going to stop them from doing that, even if it doesn't look like they're doing much at all. If they feel better, sometimes psychologically, this is the same thing with things like foam rollers and stuff like that. Is there research to support that they can help? Yeah. Is it sort of psychological? Yeah. So if the person feels good, then, then have at it, right? With stretching, I I think the big key here is that most kids don't move much. So let's get them moving. If that means that they want to stretch for a couple hours a night and they, don't really know what they're doing, I don't think there's too much issue with that unless they're really starting to push the intensity of that stretch too much. Stretching on its own is probably not going to change things too much. It's going to make you feel better for a little while, and then you're going to probably set right back to where you were, because what we're talking about is actually a nervous system thing here. We're trying to inhibit the nervous system, and a lot of the times the nervous system is what's holding a person back from getting better range. And so the way you show the nervous system that you can be there is first of all by being able to breathe comfortably in a position. So in a stretch, if we're forcing a breath super bad, like we're going to be in a sympathetic overdrive, not a parasympathetic overdrive, where we're trying to bring everything down and let the body relax. So that's the first step, is to be able to breathe into these positions. But then the second step is to be able to produce force in those positions. And so that can be something, an example of that could be if I'm stretching, say, a hamstring here, and I've got my leg up, and I go into the deepest position I can. I just round my back, and I'm kind of pushing and forcing my breathing really hard. Well, that is not any way to inhibit the nervous system to allow you to go any further. You have to be able to get into a position where you can actually fill your belly up with air and then fully exhale and relax into that deeper stretch. Once I have established that a few, rounds of breathing and being able to relax into that, now I need to be able to produce force there at a lengthened state. Where do most injuries happen? In an eccentric manner, where the muscle is getting longer under force, right? You see this in soccer and things like that, where there's a braking force and then the quad ruptures or whatever, or the calf. And so what often happens is that deceleration pattern is what causes us to have those tears. So what we need to be able to do is get better at providing tension and force in a lengthened range and in a shortened range. We often don't do the shortened range either, right? So the ability to breathe comfortably, and then the ability to start to push down and actually contract the hamstring isometrically in those positions where there's low inflammation, and you're starting to, again, tell the nervous system, I can be here, I have the strength to get there. And I use the example often of if I don't know if you can see this, but if I have my foot up, okay, here, now this isn't perfect, this is not high enough, but if this was 90 degrees roughly, I could do that on both legs, right? But I am nowhere near being able to do the splits like my 10-year-old self could do. And so I need to say, well, why is that? Obviously, I can get there, right? I could show you a 90-degree pattern on both legs, so I theoretically should be able to go into the splits. Why can't I go into the splits? In a very simplified way, it's generally because the brain doesn't think that I have the strength to be there. So it's not just the length portion that's the problem. I've shown that I can be there, and it's letting me be there. But as soon as I get out with my legs and I start to walk out, it says, hey, he's never had force produced in this length of muscle before, or at least not much of it. He hasn't trained that before. So we have to slowly produce force at those differing lengths. So that really didn't answer your question. It was more of a tangent. But from a stretching standpoint, I'd say from a young age, let them start to use that as a way to move their body and to get some body awareness and to feel what it feels like to stretch something versus to contract something. As they get older, they need to be able to understand anatomy a little bit more. And I think it's really important that they actually try and do that and study it a little bit so that they have an ownership over their body as to the training that they're doing as well. And then they can get into the specific stretches that are going to be super important for that area.
Okay, Paul, there were a couple of other questions. One was, what did the kids do mostly 50 years ago that we are missing now that gave them the mobility we are looking for now?
Beautiful question. Everything. They did dangerous play. They did gymnastics in school. In Russia and the Soviet countries, it was like it was just what they did. Gymnastics was a normal thing, and in fact, a lot of elderly people from Russia can, and actually in some of the Asian countries as well, can pop into a gymnastics routine like nothing at 65, 70 years old, even if they haven't done it for years. Yeah, the unstructured play, I think, was a big one. Kids aren't really allowed to play anymore. So that, and it's amazing how quickly that can happen, where that gets undone, right? Like, kids are meant to move and they're meant to explore through movement. A big part of who they are comes from their development of movement, and their ability to get away from somebody telling them what to do. They figure things out. They take risks. Sometimes they get hurt. Most of the time they actually learn from that, and they make calculated risks. With that, you're going to be moving your body in all sorts of motions, and just acting out. I mean, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old right now, so this is like full on for me. And you can just see how acting out in dance and theater and all these things, climbing and not necessarily, I think specialization also plays into it, because we're specializing earlier and earlier, right? And that's for another time probably, but I think that that foundation, that generalist movement practice has been sort of lost, but I think it's been lost right from that school playground type stuff, and then moves outwards, right? So I think that would be my best guess on that. And then in certain sports, in certain sporting organizations, some require a baseline level of movement, and others don't have much structure to their movement in through the adolescent and teen years. And it kind of shows. In the States, they put a lot more into strength and conditioning, and not just the actual lifting portions of it, but it's the movements as well. So sometimes in Canada, it depends on where you are for that, but that's why I think an approach, like a provincial approach of having certain, and it doesn't have to be like set in stone, but here are the main things that we need these kids to be able to do, not just so they can be good cross-country skiers, but so they can be fully capable human beings of moving their bodies the way they should be able to, and then they can take that with them for life, right?
Okay, next question was, are there resources that give an idea for target range of motion by age or by joint?
Oh. There are resources, I'm sure. I know that there are. I don't necessarily abide by them necessarily, because each individual is going to be totally different, and you have to keep in mind that we're going to see gender differences, we're going to see age differences developmentally. Again, puberty is going to be a big one for these kids as to what's happening. But also we're going to see different ethnic backgrounds have different structural characteristics within certain joints as well. We see in the Asian population a much shallower, generally speaking, a much shallower hip socket, which is actually going to be really good for mobility. So for crossing legs, for squatting, for things like that. Maybe not as good for stability, but you're going to see, that's just one example of something you can see these individual differences. Pelvis's articulation of the femur and the pelvis structurally, sometimes a person's not going to be able to squat. They're just not meant to squat. We all can squat to some extent, but to load somebody whose femur is rotated in a certain way that's just not, beneficial for them to squat, to force that is not going to be wise. So we have to sort of figure these things out on an individual level. In terms of range of motion, for me, it comes down to the control of the range of motion. So we want we just went through the cards to show you what a joint is capable of doing, right? And a lot of it comes into a circular pattern, so a flexion, extension, and then some sort of a rotation component through most joints. You know, we can look at things like the functional movement screen that we do, which is sort of a way that we can assess what is the general movement pattern of the individual, and we have like objective measures that we hit there. So like lying on your back, leg raise, active straight leg raise would be sort of a 90-degree position, would be, you know, sort of a prerequisite for most things done well. We can get by without that much. That's why I don't abide by these things completely. It's sort of looking at what are the needs of the sport, first of all. What are the prerequisites of the actual sport itself? What are we asking, you know, the shoulders to be able to do? What are we asking the hips and the ribs to do? All these sorts of things. And if the person is inhibited in those ways, then that's for sure, we need to address that. But then we also have to look at, okay, well, what are the prerequisites of the lifts that we're asking them to do, right? Again, going back to the squat, you need to have full range at your ankles, knees, and hips as a prereq to get into a deep squat right away. So those are things that generally having greater range of motion, but having control over that range is going to be huge, because you're going to have some people that are uber flexible that have no stability in those positions, and they're going to be just as injured as the, you know, super tight, awkward teenage boy who can't, you know, touch his toes or come anywhere near that. They're probably going to have similar issues, right? So it's not just about the range that we need to get, it's about that control and strength within those ranges. Any other questions there for the sort of mobility?
I've got another question. Is there a website or somewhere that we could see these again? I would need a refresher of what you showed us earlier. Is there somewhere where we can see that? I
can send a video off to be sent out to everybody that I've created for our athletes and for our clients and stuff. So I can definitely send those off. Yeah.
And Paul, if you're comfortable, this is being recorded. So if you're okay with me sharing the recording, then.
No, yeah, you can share. Everybody can see my basement again. So there's a couple directions we can go here. I know we got about 10 minutes left. I think going through stability exercises right now, we're just not going to have enough time to really cover a ton. What I'd like to maybe talk to you for maybe for 5 more minutes about is the principles of that, and then answer any questions that we have. And again, I can try and provide some resources for some of the stuff that we've gone through, because one of the big things that we had to do with COVID early on was Zoom sessions. Like we had a lot of the Ontario athletes and the NTDC athletes together doing exactly what you just went through. So we would do mobility. Early on, it was sort of like a mobility day 1 and then a stability day 2, and then eventually they were combined, and then that was brought into training, and that was still being done on Zoom. So it was actually a good, I think it was actually a really good thing, because it would forced us to come back to these things that sometimes get, you know, fast forwarded in a regular year, and everybody was at home and not a lot of people had equipment. So it was a good time to really come back to the basics of mobility and stability. And stability, you know, when I'm looking at stability, it's the ability to buttress or support an area, right? So a lot of the time what we're trying to do in lifting is support the spine, because the spine, when it's not in the right position and it gets loaded in a heavy way, that is subjective to injury, obviously. At the same time, we're supporting joints along the way, so that one is not making up for the other one. Everything is doing its job in a sort of spider web kind of mentality. One of the big things that we look at is hip stability and rib to hip connection. And you know, the people around here are probably sick of hearing me say this, but I just keep seeing it over and over again, is that the distance or the gap between the ribs and the hips, you know, in a lot of movements that we do needs to be the same. It needs to be the same as if you're standing up tall. So if I'm loading, you know, if I'm going into a deadlift as an example, you know, and I go to pick up, you know, a bar up off the ground, well, this looks like a position that, you know, I'm over top, I'm flexed quite a bit. This looks like sort of a dangerous position to a lot of people. What we have to notice is that when I hinge through my hips, the connection between my ribs and the hips, which was here to start with when I was standing, is actually the same here, which means that I've kept the same curve in my back. And now what I'm using is the stability around that, the trunk stability, to be able to hold that position so that I can let my hips do the work. So when I pick up that bar, I'm not changing my back and arching up here or breaking down in my spine that way. I'm actually holding super strong here and using my hips to generate the movement. So that is one, like, just a simple principle of, and just to go into, say, what that looks like, and you're going to see some terrible pulling technique here. But when we see the athletes that do this well, when they come through, they're over top and they're solid through here. This is straight, right? They're not here and they're not back here and having to wave more through their pulling. They're very much strong over top of it, and they can derive a lot of power out of that. And this is what we see in a lot of the development camps when we see, you know, some of the World Cup athletes versus some of the younger developmental athletes, is that they haven't trained that the glute drive to come through, the connection with the ribs, the hips, and then the stability around here to hold that position strong so that their arms now and their shoulders can do the work. It's the same thing that we see here when this is not working well around the spine. Then we try and do more up through the shoulders. We start to get overuse up here. You know, we lose the ability to have a good connection through the glenohumeral joint to move that in a good range of motion, because now we're trying to make up for something we don't have down here. So a lot of the work that we do from a stability work standpoint is going to be looking at how are my glutes working for me. First of all, is there an understanding of how to do that? But then are they actually producing a good hip extension movement, both in a skate and then again in a classic, without the range of motion at the hip, and I go to use my hip extension here. When I'm maxed out, if it's maxed out here, I'm going to go into a big bow to come through, right? So it's going to look like this. And then again, I've got a lot of aching back happening there. So we're looking at the mobility to get in the position, and then we need to be able to use the glutes with the core in a unilateral way. And that's a big one. A lot of young athletes are not doing unilateral work, they're just doing bilateral. So doing 2-leg squats versus single-leg squats, or 2-leg deadlifts versus single-leg deadlifts. So we need to get into that single-sided stuff as well. So again, very general sort of overview of that. We do a lot of shoulder stability work as well. Again, looking at how the scapula is moving in through rotation, but also how is the glenohumeral joint working as a unit, and, you know, how much strength can we derive in those different ranges. Does anybody have questions? Again, I know we're short on time, so I just want to honor that for everybody. If there's any questions on that, very simple way of looking at it.
Not seeing anything, Paul, coming up.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, the other thing that we see a lot of people breaking down as well when they go from 2 legs to 1 leg, or 2 arms to 1 arm. So really understanding, you know, how we can transition from getting away from just seeing somebody move well in a two-legged squat to then sticking them on one leg, and all of a sudden we see this breakdown, and they're going to be on that one leg a lot, whether they're actually skiing or just training. So we need to make sure that we're building that body awareness and stability from an early age there.
I have a question for Paul.
Yeah.
Paul, earlier on you mentioned filling your abdomen when you're stabilizing. How do you cue athletes to not contract their core, but to actually fill their core to be stable?
Sorry, that last part, Kevin, I lost you. Not contract, but...
Yeah, so rather than just contracting everything to stabilize the core and hollowing out their abdomen, rather have them to fill their abdomen. How do you?
That's a great question. So, talking about the difference, if I'm hearing you correctly, the difference between hollowing and bracing, and the hollowing technique was sort of developed in a rehab setting by Hodges. Some researchers from Australia, and it got misused. It was very good research, and it was a way of getting people to basically learn how to use their core again after an accident or after an injury when they lost the ability to have control over that. So the hollowing method would be sort of like the belly button to the spine, or hollowing out the front here, and getting, sometimes can be equated to some of the transverse abdominis or pelvic floor work, which again is really good work. But generally speaking, if that's where it stops, it's incomplete, because what we're doing is essentially taking a cardboard box with an empty top and flipping it on its side and then loading it, right? You're not going to have 300, you're not going to be buttressing that spine from all the way around. You're going to be doing that from one section. And so in terms of cueing, it depends on the athlete. So sometimes it's going to be tactile, sometimes it's going to be, something that they hear auditory or see. Everybody's going to be a little bit different on how they learn. One technique I've found that works quite well is just underneath the ribs, is sort of pushing in and then stiffening against that so that the hands actually get pushed out. So this would be on like an inhale, so filling the air in and then stiffening again to push that out. So you're feeling like a widening. Sometimes just an auditory or a visual is just like the old Bruce Lee poster of like, when he's going for a punch. And what you would do is, if somebody came up and just drove their fist into your abdomen, what would you do? You probably wouldn't go like this and draw in and suck in. You'd probably brace against that. And in a broad sense, that's essentially what we're doing. But the breathing is such a big part of this that I think a lot of the younger athletes, a lot of the athletes in general are missing, and they're missing out because there's been a lot of misunderstanding of breathing and its role in both inhibiting nervous system, so flexibility, mobility work, but then also stability and being able to lift a big load. Like when you're lifting a big load, you've got to be able to hold a lot of tension. That's probably the limiting factor for most people, is the tension. And if they're not being able to use their diaphragm well to be able to fill down and not just up here. So when they go to lift, you see this happening a lot. And then, they go to lift something and everything's up here and this hasn't done a thing, right? So part of that is just learning how to relax into breathing without trying to create tension at all, and being able to have like hand on chest, hand on belly in different positions on your back, sitting up in a chair, and being able to actually fill the belly down. And then it's almost like a wave where you're getting like a belly and then chest and then belly that hollows back in, right? And doing that wave up and then that wave down. And for a lot of people, that's going to be easily done on your back. But that's sort of one way we use the breath to fill that space and then be able to brace on that space.
Right. Without having, yeah,
question?
right. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, and the breath part, I like the connection to the breath, that it's not bracing and holding your breath it's bracing and still allowing breath to continue, right? And
yeah, for most things, I would agree with that. The only issue there is that if you're lifting maximally at all, you're going to have to hold your breath. You're going to have to Valsalva. And, you know, there's been a lot of physiologists that sort of poo-pooed that. But if we do that all the time when we go to the bathroom, you don't see people saying that's a health risk. But the problem is that when we're doing most things, most of the time, we shouldn't, you know, it shouldn't be a Valsalva for sure. But when you've got a big load that you're trying to lift, and you're not holding your breath at the bottom for at least a split second, you're probably going to destabilize in some way. You're not gonna be able to do it. You definitely want to be able to breathe through that as you go. So we always say, like, sort of inhaling in the down portion or before the down portion, a slight hold at the bottom, and then forcefully exhaling through the hard portion of the lift. You know, so if you're squatting, you've already inhaled. When you're coming through, that's when you're exhaling as you're coming up. You know, and that makes sense, but it often gets reversed sometimes. So yeah, that's the only caveat to that, is that in a maximal lifting scenario, you're going to have some sort of Valsalva, but what you want to do is reduce sort of the intracranial pressure, and then in the chest as well. We want to be able to release that fairly soon. The longer that goes on, the worse it's probably going to be.
Right, it's timing and cycling through that, the bracing at the right time. Double pull, same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very conscious breath cycle that you have to go through, and it's not always natural, because when you're running, you're sort of just breathing as you need to. But when you're lifting, and then when we get into things like swings, like kettlebell swings and things like that, where the movement is faster and it's a very forceful movement, it's very quick. You know, you're having to be super conscious of a quick, full inhale and then a forceful exhale, and then having that come back right away. So yeah, it depends on what we're doing, but breathing is such a big component.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, Paul, I have one last question in the chat.
Sure.
How do we get athletes to feel they are using their glutes?
How do we get them to feel that they're using their glutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we get caught up sometimes. Sometimes we're guilty, and this is in the rehab world, where we need everybody to be able to engage their certain muscles, right? Engaging your glutes, engaging your core is sort of a catch term. You know, if they're doing certain movements, they're likely forced to do that. And so sometimes psychologically getting it in their heads that they're supposed to feel something, you know, they might be doing it totally fine. And if we ask them if they're feeling it and they say no, that might screw with their mind a little bit and think that they should be, and they are. You know, what we'll see often is when they're not using certain muscle groups to produce a movement, is that we're going to see compensations within those movements. So again, with the glutes, we might see an extension of the lumbar spine, a big arch in that, and an overuse there. So that might be a key. In terms of like just getting them to understand that a little bit more, so I'll use tactile, like literally jabbing their thumbs in their glutes when they come up into something like a glute bridge or a top deadlift position, to be able to really feel whether or not that's happening. Things like squeeze your butt cheeks, try and hold a loonie in your butt cheeks or something, get them to really laugh a little bit, but then they understand what that means, right? So it's you know, getting creative with how you do that. The thing about that though is that I don't want everybody just leaving here and assuming that that's what they need to do. The problem is that we can see the pelvis change into a poor position when we think that we're tightening our glutes. So I'll just give you one quick example of that, and then I'll let you guys go if you haven't gone yet. But what we try and do in a bridge is that you know, one of the problems is that we can get too much into, say, a posterior tilt here where we're tucking the tail under, or an anterior tilt, which creates too much of an arch in the back. So when we get people in bridges, they have to be able to hold a neutral spine, something normal like they're standing, and then when they come up, they have to squeeze their glutes in a way that keeps that rib to hip connection the same. If they do it where they tilt the pelvis, what we're going to see is that sort of motion where the back flattens out, and we're actually in a flex position here. So if we actually turn that into a, you know, deadlift position where they were coming, we would be looking like this, where we're flexing up when we go to lift. So what we want to be able to do is maintain this position where that pelvis is actually in that same, you know, in that same position. It's not tilting one way or another when we do that. So that's where, you know, how we do it really matters. Not just feeling glutes tighten, because we can tighten the glutes a very, very core movement at the same time. So we need to be able to feel that we have control over that, but then actually produce the movement we're trying to produce. Hopefully that was helpful.
Okay, I think we need to wrap it up. We have one maybe quick thing. I do want to address people's questions. So what about using a band with a legs only skating drill to activate glutes so they can feel them?
Oh yeah, you know, there literally is millions of ways we can do that. And there, yeah, great skating patterns is great. Again, if it's producing the motion that you're looking for without then going into something further, then absolutely. There's tons of ways we can use isometric work and holds positions or holding positions at the top to feel that. We get people to do, you know, bridges where we shut one glute off at a time, re-engage, shut the other glute off, re-engage. We actually see the pelvis dip. We get manual work where we're, you know, getting them into a hip extension and pushing on that heel to get them to resist the push of the coach, which is going to inevitably get them to fire the glutes. I don't want you to take too much of that and say, okay, the number one goal is get them to fire the glutes. If we're teaching movement patterns from a young age and doing a good job of explaining how we want that pattern to be created, then we're probably likely going to be engaging glutes, if we want to call it that. We're getting tension there. We'll often go, you know, even in ski erg machines, we'll get in the ski erg, we'll have people banded around their hips being pulled from the back just lightly, so they, when they come up, they're actually feeling that position, and they have to use their glutes to be able to do that. So important as the glutes are, we don't want to get too caught up in just, you know, which exercises, you know, because we need to know when we want to implement a lot of this stuff, and it's very individual, hard to relay in a talk like this.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. Wish we had another hour to do more.
Yes, thank you for having
me. I'll be in touch. Thank you, and have a good night. And thanks everyone for attending. And I will post the recording on our website again and get in touch with you with the PowerPoint presentation. So thanks so much for taking the time, for being here with us all. Thanks, Paul. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.